A true talent. Absolutely a talent. The old teacher, who is the most trusted assistant of the Count, feels that those who are examined in the imperial exams are not necessarily considered great talents. If one is a bit smarter, works harder, and has some good luck, they can pass. But real talents must have great intelligence, the ability to see through the essence of chaotic matters, just like Mr. Shen. Only with such insight can one avoid taking the wrong path and avoid leading a family into ruin. The old teacher never expected that heaven would grant him such a perfect face and intelligent mind. He decided that he must tell the Count about this and make sure the gem of this young man does not get hidden in the dust. As the class ended, the old teacher, who used to hurry to leave after class, had developed a strange attachment. He had to teach a group of simpletons, which felt like a waste of time. But he couldn't just send anyone to teach in the presence of the air. The air, however, was particularly dense. Teaching him was like playing a violin to a cow, and the only person capable of truly enjoying the art of teaching and educating was Mr. Shen. After the class, Heir Kim Mukdong looked a little envious as he asked Mr. Shen, "Mr. Shen, do you have any friends?" "No," Mr. Shen replied. "Then why do you think you don't have friends?" Kim Mukdong asked. Mr. Shen answered, "I'm too handsome, too excellent. It makes others feel overshadowed. They're always envious of me. How could I have friends?" Kim Mukdong clenched his fist in frustration. He didn't know why, but he felt like hitting someone. But remembering the list of enemies Mr. Shen had written on the wall, he became frustrated and angrily said, "I don't get along with you!" Kim Mukdong moved to the seat behind, leaving Mr. Shen sitting alone at the front. Around them, young people were whispering and gossiping. "Humph, what's he bragging about? If he's so talented, why doesn't he take the exams himself?" "Exactly! Someone who lacks ability ends up being a son-in-law. Just a pretty boy! What's so special about him?" Mr. Shen could not help but feel a bit helpless. It seemed that his reputation for being generous had not spread, and these people did not seem to fear him. Next was a math class. This was an elective course, not required for exams, and many schools did not teach it. However, noble families had more detailed curricula, nurturing professional talent across generations. At the Count School, math was not only mandatory, but also highly emphasized. Mr. Hu, an assistant to the Count, managed the Count's estates and wealth, making him a powerful figure in the household. He had held power for many years, which made him arrogant and dismissive of others. Most scholars of math, especially those as skilled as Mr. Hu, had quirky personalities. He was no exception. As the most distinguished math scholar in Xuanwu City, Mr. Hu became the Count's math teacher. Upon entering the classroom, Mr. Hu's eyes immediately landed on Mr. Shen. With his handsome face, Mr. Shen stood out no matter where he went. Mr. Hu's gaze held a hint of hostility, which Mr. Shen quickly noticed. He could feel the intense rivalry from Mr. Hu, although he couldn't understand the cause. Mr. Hu began the lesson, and Mr. Shen found himself drifting off. The material was very basic, just elementary arithmetic, so Mr. Shen's thoughts wandered. Suddenly, Mr. Hu shouted sharply, "Mr. Shen, stand up!" The sudden shout was loud and jarring, and it woke up all the drowsy students. Mr. Shen stood up, and Mr. Hu, holding a ruler, stepped toward him coldly. "Extend your hand. 10 hits," he said flatly. 47.2. Mr. Shen realized that Mr. Hu wasn't trying to harm him with devious plots, it was just his frustration and hostility. Mr. Hu had been in power for a long time, becoming increasingly arrogant and direct in his methods. Mr. Shen figured that perhaps he had blocked Mr. Hu's path in some way. Mr. Hu's eyes were full of contempt, and he shouted, "Stand up. Extend your hand. 10 hits. You need to learn to respect the rules." Mr. Shen stood his ground, but his mind quickly analyzed the situation. He was being singled out. But why? "Why me?" Mr. Shen asked. Mr. Hu, already on edge, snapped, "You didn't listen in class. You were off in your own world, working on your own things. Shouldn't you be punished?" Mr. Shen, unfazed, replied, "The things you're teaching I already know, so there's no need to pay close attention." Mr. Hu was taken aback. He had never encountered a student so nonchalantly defiant. Even the heir, Kim Muk-thong, had been subdued in class. After Mr. Hu's outburst, he demanded 30 hits, and Mr. Shen was supposed to kneel for 3 hours in front of Confucius's statue. But Mr. Shen, feeling the sting of Mr. Hu's words, gritted his teeth, knowing that the old teacher's punishment was more about frustration than actual wrongdoing. Kim Muk-thong, noticing Mr. Shen's situation, said, "You're in trouble now. You'll get at least 30 lashes, maybe more." "Is this how Mr. Hu usually behaves?" Mr. Shen asked. Kim Muk-thong sighed and nodded. He had been beaten by Mr. Hu several times himself. "He's the one managing all the financial matters of the Count's estate, so my father holds him in high regard. His temper is terrible, and many people in the household are afraid of him." "I understand. People like Mr. Hu, skilled in their field, often lacked emotional intelligence. He was a tyrant in his domain, and there was little room for dissent." "Did he encourage you to beat me yesterday?" Mr. Shen asked. Kim Muk-thong hesitated and quickly shook his head. "I can't say. It would be dishonorable to speak of it." "Who is Mr. Hu related to? Is he connected to Wang Lian, Ma Ya, or Jin Xiying?" Kim Muk-thong answered, "He is Wang Lian's cousin. He's also a distant relative of my mother's." Mr. Shen realized the connection. Mr. Hu had once hoped to marry into the Count's family, but his hopes were dashed when Mr. Shen took the place. Now, Mr. Hu was harboring resentment and trying to sabotage Mr. Shen.
Overall, Shen Lang had just barely managed to create an image of freedom, indulgence, and unrestrained charm in front of his mother-in-law, where now, because of a certain Hu Wenqiu, he had to beg her for mercy. This was completely ruining the image Shen Lang had so carefully cultivated. This Hu Wenqiu was a distant relative of his mother-in-law. If Shen Lang were to beg her, wouldn't it make things difficult for her? How could he make his superior uncomfortable? Could he still keep up his image? Thus, Shen Lang decided to remain calm and sit back in his seat, quietly waiting for Hu Wenqiu to bring his father-in-law. "Why aren't you running?" Kim Muk-thong asked. "If you wait, you'll be beaten and no one will save you." Sure enough, after a while, hurried footsteps could be heard outside. "Lord Count, I can't teach this student. I've never encountered such an ill-mannered person." Hu Wenqiu's voice, clear even from a distance, reached everyone's ears. The students in the room, all seated properly, were excited and curious, waiting to see what would happen. They were eagerly anticipating a spectacle. My great Yan dynasty places great emphasis on the relationship between heaven, earth, the ruler, the subjects, the parents, and the teachers. But Shen Lang is disrespectful, not caring for the elderly. His behavior on a small scale is corrupting his peers, and on a large scale, it's ruining the Count's family traditions. His crime is unforgivable. I request that Lord Count punish him. Otherwise, the learning environment at the Count's school will be ruined." Shen Lang really didn't know what to say. If Hu Wenqiu didn't like him, shouldn't he have just held his anger in, waited for an opportunity to strike a blow to him later? It seemed like this was just the start of a big disaster for him, and he would be thrown out of the Count's house. Even if he was punished with 30 lashes today, Hu Wenqiu would only release his pent-up anger, and it wouldn't really change anything. Lord Count arrived at Shen Lang's side and coldly asked, "Why are you causing trouble? You can behave like this outside, but why act like this here?" As he spoke, Lord Count's hand instinctively tightened around a whip. Lord Count was conservative and old-fashioned. If a student and teacher had a conflict, it was always the student's fault. Usually, without any questions, the teacher would hit first. Kim Mooch Thong didn't even know how many times he had been beaten, just because a teacher reported him. Thus, he, the somewhat overweight heir, was easily manipulated in front of the teacher. Lord Count said, "Shen Lang, if you don't explain yourself properly, don't blame me for being heartless." The 30 lashes seemed inevitable. Shen Lang said, "Father-in-law, I haven't done anything wrong." "Lord Count, look, he still refuses to admit his mistake. There's really no saving him," Hu Wenqiu coldly mocked. Shen Lang replied, "Excuse me, Mr. Hu, did I whisper or talk during your class?" Hu Wenqiu muttered. Shen Lang continued, "Did I read any irrelevant material or even fall asleep on my desk?" Hu Wenqiu grumbled again. Shen Lang said, "If I didn't do any of these things, how could I be disrespectful to my teacher?" Hu Wenqiu replied, "When I was lecturing, you were daydreaming. That's disrespectful. Teachers invest their heart and soul to pass on knowledge, and yet you were off doing your own things. Isn't that ruining the study environment? Why does the Count's house focus on math when it's not even part of the imperial exams? In the 6 arts of a gentleman, ritual, music, archery, horsemanship, writing, and mathematics, mathematics helps us understand economics and also the transformation of the universe. The Count values mathematics because he has a far-reaching vision." This excuse immediately softened Lord Count's face. Though Shen Lang was a bit rebellious, he still understood his father-in-law's intent. Shen Lang said, "I have great respect for Mr. Hu's teaching of mathematics. I don't have any intention of disrespecting him." Hu Wenqiu scoffed. "You were daydreaming during my lecture, and yet you claim to respect me. How shameless!"
Shen Lang said, "Mr. Hu, because your teachings are relatively simple, I have already learned them. If I were to continue listening in a serious manner, it would be a waste of time. That would actually be the greatest disrespect to you. So instead, I extended my thoughts, explored the deeper aspects of mathematics. That's the true way of learning. That's true respect for the teacher." The surrounding students were momentarily stunned. Shen Lang really was good at making excuses. But why did they feel that even though they knew he was lying, his words seemed so convincing? "Ha ha 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 ha," Hu Wenqiu laughed. "You say my math is simple?" Shen Lang said sincerely, "Yes, it's too simple." Hu Wenqiu responded, "You think you understand my math?" Shen Lang said even more sincerely, "Not only do I understand it, but I also use it flexibly, applying it with ease. Hu Wenqiu laughed again, saying, "You've still got milk on your breath. You studied for 10 years at Han Shui Town School and didn't even finish the Great Learning. You've never even touched the path of mathematics, yet you claim to understand? What nonsense." At this point, Hu Wenqiu was absolutely confident in his superiority. Mathematics, while considered one of the 6 arts, wasn't heavily tested in exams, therefore few truly understood it. As for Shen Lang, even their teachers at this school wouldn't be able to match his understanding. Everyone in Xuanwu City skilled in mathematics could be counted on one hand, and Hu Wenqiu was among the best. However, Shen Lang claiming to understand everything about mathematics was incredibly foolish. Then Hu Wenqiu said, "If you claim to know everything, I will give you 10 problems. If you get 3 right, I won't pursue this further. If you get fewer than 3 right, you'll receive 30 lashes. If you get none right, you'll receive 100 lashes. How does that sound?" At these words, Lord Count frowned. He felt Hu Wenqiu might be going too far and said, "Shen Lang, apologize to Mr. Hu, and this matter will be over. From now on, don't daydream in class." Lord Count, being conservative and traditional, didn't want to upset Mr. Hu, but he still felt some sympathy for Shen Lang. "Mr. Hu, if an apology will solve everything, then I'll apologize," Shen Lang said, bowing slightly. "Father-in-law, please be a witness, as well as all of you students here." Lord Count was about to reprimand Shen Lang, but the teacher, who had been a part of the Count's family for over 70 years, smiled and said, "Fine, I'll be a witness." This old teacher was not only Kim Muk-tong's teacher, but also Lord Count's. When he spoke, Lord Count couldn't refuse. Lord Count glared at Shen Lang and said, "You'd better not be so reckless. When you're punished later, don't cry." Hu Wenqiu said, "If I were the teacher, I would take care of the punishment myself."
Of course, Hu Wenqiu hadn't finished speaking. If Shen Lang were to answer 5 or more of the problems correctly, it would prove that Hu Wenqiu had made a fuss for no reason, and that he would have to make everyone witness Shen Lang's apology. But how could that possibly happen? Even the sun setting wouldn't help him, so there was no need to speak further. Remember, you have half an hour to solve these problems. If you're late, there's no waiting. Then Hu Wenqiu lit an incense stick. The incense would burn for an hour. Seeing this, Lord Count couldn't help but shake his head helplessly. He feared that Shen Lang would be in trouble soon. When Hu Wenqiu was young, he had been extremely competitive and arrogant, never tolerating anyone. But as a successful leader, the most important thing was to use people wisely. He had placed key talents in key positions. If all the talents were used up and things were consumed, that would be problematic. In the past, Lord Count had done this well, but now, facing this situation, he couldn't handle it. On the left side was his son-in-law, who, although mischievous and different from him, Lord Count genuinely liked and respected. On the right side was his trusted aide, who had managed the Count's affairs for over 20 years, and was someone Lord Count highly respected. Therefore, there were times when, as the Lord, it was difficult to act according to his desires. For the dozen or so young students in the room, this was the perfect show to watch. They were so excited they could hardly contain themselves. Shen Lang had actually dared to challenge the strict and powerful Hu Wenqiu, something that hadn't happened in 10 years. They were so eager to see it. Though they were somewhat on Shen Lang's side, they couldn't help but want to see him punished with 100 lashes. "Why did you marry our goddess? If you're unlucky, then it's your fault." When Shen Lang saw the 10 questions, he couldn't help but mutter softly, I thought that Hu Wenqiu spent over an hour to come up with these questions. How difficult could they be? Turns out they were this simple? As a master student, solving these math problems felt like using a butcher's knife to slaughter a pig. When Shen Lang wrote the answer, he felt like he was mentally challenged solving such an easy problem. Of course, this problem was very simple for Shen Lang, but for others in this world, it was already difficult enough. At least for the dozen or so students in this room, it would be nearly impossible to solve this problem in a short time. This problem is from the 1993 Math Olympiad for 4th graders, and yes, someone failed to solve it. Don't ask how I know. Next, Shen Lang looked at the second problem. This one's a bit interesting. Though still very simple for Shen Lang, it was a bit more difficult for this world. There's an unknown number of items, with some of them having multiples of 3, others multiples of 2, etc. The total is barely 100, asking how many items there are. This requires equations. In less than 3 seconds, Shen Lang figured out the answer, 23. Even an extraterrestrial calculator wouldn't be needed. The third question was even more interesting. 3 people travel 70 miles, 5 plum trees are planted together, and after half a month, a group of 7 is reunited. Subtracting 105, what's the result? You think that by writing it as a poem, you can hide the fact that it's just a simple math problem? Shen Lang again easily solved the answer without much effort. Next were the 4th, 5th, and 6th questions, and then the 9th one. Truly, not a single one of these problems gave Shen Lang any difficulty. None of them took him more than 2 minutes to solve. So he placed all his expectations on the final, most difficult question.
This last question occupied an entire page. Shen Lang glanced at it and his eyes widened. This one had some substance, some difficulty. In fact, it was incredibly difficult. There were 20 trees in total, with 4 trees in each row, and a few rows had more trees. If there were fewer than 14 rows, the problem would be unsolvable. Though the problem seemed simple at first glance, it was actually a 1,000-year-old mathematical puzzle on Earth. Most people would think that, with 20 trees and 4 trees in each row, the solution would be 5 rows. Of course, this wasn't the case because the arrangement could be based on irregular shapes, which could easily surpass 5 rows. In the 16th century, the Romans managed to complete an arrangement with 16 rows. By the 18th century, the famous mathematician Gauss completed an arrangement with 18 rows. It wasn't until the end of the 20th century that 2 computer experts used machines to achieve 20 rows, setting a new record. But now, in the 21st century, someone completed 23 rows. This was one of Hu Wenqiu's proudest problems. He discovered it from an ancient mathematical text. He spent over a decade solving the puzzle and finally managed to arrange 14 rows. Not only that, but he loved to use this problem to challenge others, including the Count's associates, the Count himself, and those newly graduated scholars. No one could match his level of mathematical expertise. He had spent years perfecting this problem, and now he was using it to test Shen Lang. Of course, Hu Wenqiu didn't actually expect Shen Lang to solve it. He just wanted to show off. He wanted Shen Lang, this country bumpkin, to see how incredible Hu Wenqiu really was. Fine, to Hu Wenqiu, solving 14 rows was indeed impressive. But for Shen Lang, it hadn't even reached the 16th century level. Shen Lang could easily solve 23 rows, surpassing Hu Wenqiu's answer by at least 1,000 years. This was truly out of this world. Shen Lang was crushing Hu Wenqiu completely. He was sure that this would stun Hu Wenqiu to the point of speechlessness. Shen Lang had already completed the first 9 questions in less than 10 minutes. For the last question, he spent more than half an hour. Of course, in his mind, he solved it in an instant, coming up with the brilliant answer, setting a new record. but transferring it to paper required some time to ensure precision. This was a very intricate geometric pattern, and any slight mistake would be unacceptable. That's why Shen Lang spent so much time on it. During the process, to avoid creating any pressure, Lord Count and the old teacher stayed out of sight. Shen Lang, sitting at the front, couldn't hide his smugness as he observed Shen Lang working. He had been paying attention to Shen Lang and noticed that he spent very little time on the first 9 questions, but took most of his time on the final question. This was typical behavior. In his view, the first 9 questions were basic, rigid problems. If you knew the answer, you got it. If you didn't, you didn't. He was certain that Shen Lang wouldn't know the answers to these questions, so he hurriedly glanced at them and scribbled down random answers. But the last question was, despite its difficulty, a more flexible problem. Everyone would hold hope for it and keep trying different answers. Hu Wenqiu had spent over a decade solving the puzzle with 14 rows, so he was confident Shen Lang would never get it right. Thus, he was prepared for the punishment. After all, Shen Lang was just a young, arrogant fool with no education. He had the audacity to challenge him. As he watched, Hu Wenqiu felt even more pleased. Shen Lang had no idea what he was up against. Finally, the incense finished. It was time. Hu Wenqiu coldly said, "Time's up. Submit your papers." He walked over and snatched the paper from Shen Lang's desk. "A no-education, no-job fool," Hu Wenqiu muttered, as he flipped through Shen Lang's answers. Then he looked at the first question. He sneered, but then stopped, and looked again. Could it be correct? How was that possible? This first question, though the simplest, far exceeded the scope of what he had taught. For someone who didn't understand advanced mathematics, all they could do was add 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on until reaching 100, which would easily take up the whole incense time. But Shen Lang had provided a perfect solution. Looking at the second problem, still correct. The third, still correct. Shen Lang's expression changed instantly. The fourth, fifth, and sixth problems, still correct. In fact, Shen Lang's methods were even more refined and accurate than Hu Wenqiu's. Sweat started pouring down Hu Wenqiu's back. He had said that if Shen Lang answered 5 questions correctly, he would apologize to him in front of everyone. Now Shen Lang had answered 5 questions correctly. What was he supposed to do? Looking at the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th questions, Hu Wenqiu was no longer just sweating. He was completely stunned. Was this a ghost? This had to be a ghost.
Of course, Hu Wenqiu had clearly seen it. The first 9 questions that Shen Lang solved, he completed in just a short amount of time, without any complicated calculations. He almost instantly wrote down the answers. Originally, Hu Wenqiu thought Shen Lang was just writing nonsense, but to his surprise, all of them were correct. This was ridiculous. These 9 questions were extremely advanced mathematical problems, and almost no one in Xuanmu City could solve them. Even Hu Wenqiu himself required a significant amount of time and a lot of calculations to solve them. Shen Lang get it in no time. How did he manage that? The key was Shen Lang didn't even use any calculation methods, so how did he come to the answers? Shen Lang must have never studied these advanced math problems. Was he born with such abilities? This couldn't possibly be true, right? Hu Wenqiu closed his eyes to calm his nerves, then turned to look at the 10th problem. With the first 9 problems, Shen Lang had already answered them correctly, and Hu Wenqiu had already lost face. The 10th problem was the pinnacle of mathematical intellect, a true test of his skills. 20 trees, 4 trees in a row. How many rows are there in total? This problem was one he found in an ancient mathematical text, and after over 10 years of effort, he had figured out how to arrange 14 rows. Hu Wenqiu was confident that Shen Lang would never be able to solve it, because this was true intellectual mathematics. But he glanced at the problem. Hu Wenqiu felt his scalp tingle and a chill run down his spine. What? Shen Lang? Did he go insane? No. Is this the work of the gods? This is a geometric puzzle, simple once you understand it. Hu Wenqiu looked at the problem and immediately realized that Shen Lang's solution surpassed the 13 rows he had done. Then he began to count. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 23. A full 23 rows! It made him question his own existence and gave him goosebumps. How is this even possible? 20 trees, 4 trees in a row, and yet you can arrange 23 rows? How did you manage this? Are you human or some kind of supernatural being? I, Hu Wenqiu, spent over 10 years just arranging 14 rows. And how long did Shen Lang take? Less than half an hour. With such speed, Hu Wenqiu seriously began to doubt his own intelligence. He was losing confidence. He had always loved mathematics and his skills were highly regarded. Though he hadn't achieved success in exams, in mathematics, he felt unbeatable. It was because of this pride that he had managed to hold such an important position in the Count's household. But now seeing his own mathematical achievements crushed so easily, how could he not feel humiliated? The Countess was painting. She was highly skilled in martial arts, but she had been forced to practice since childhood and didn't enjoy it. She liked painting instead. But how good was she? Well, no one in the Count's household dared to say anything negative about it. At that moment, a servant rushed outside and quickly said, "Madam, the Count has asked you to go to the school immediately." The Countess replied casually, "What is it? Does Kim Mo-ku want to be beaten? Then let the teacher deal with it." The servant quickly said, "It's not the air, it's—" Before he could finish, the Countess said, "It is perfectly natural for teachers to punish their students. If someone else is being punished, it's the same." The servant said, "It's Shen Lang, the son-in-law. Hu Wenqiu wants to beat him with 100 lashes." Bang! The brush in the Countess's hand made a long mark on the paper. The Countess was angry. Why is Hu Wenqiu acting like this? Is he out of his mind? The Countess angrily said, "Shen Lang is so smart and well-behaved, and he wants to punish him?" With that, she suddenly threw the brush aside and quickly headed for the school. The servant struggled to keep up, his heart heavy with worry for the heir. Hu Wenqiu held Shen Lang's test paper, his hands shaking and his face pale. What should he do now? Was he really going to apologize to Shen Lang in front of everyone? How could he save face after this? In life, face was everything. No, absolutely not. Hu Wenqiu's mind raced, and suddenly he tore Shen Lang's test paper into pieces and scolded, "What nonsense is this? Not one answer is correct." After tearing the paper, there would be no evidence left. Seeing this, Shen Lang was genuinely shocked.
This Hu Wenqiu in front of him was no longer just petty. He had a serious personality defect. Could all mathematicians be like this? How had the Count endured such a person for so long? The Count frowned. Even if Shen Lang didn't answer a single question correctly, why did Hu Wenqiu have to tear up his answers? After tearing up the paper, Hu Wenqiu coldly said, "You've failed everything, messed up everything. What should you do now?" But Shen Lang, without the slightest bit of panic, pulled out a copy of his test paper that looked exactly the same. As usual, Shen Lang was always prepared for situations like this, always thinking ahead. "How clever," he said. "Since I had enough time, I was bored and decided to write 2 sets of answers." Shen Lang handed his test paper to the teacher, Mr. Lin, and said, "You are also skilled in mathematics. Help me see how many answers are correct." When these words were spoken,
Hu Wenqiu was immediately stunned. Shen Lang, how cunning! His body suddenly trembled, almost fainting. Mr. Lin, the teacher, took the test paper and said, "Those who study the Yi Jing always appreciate mathematics. Though my skills in mathematics are not as good as Mr. Hu's, I can still see what's right and wrong." Mr. Lin then began grading the paper. He looked through it from the beginning to the end, and he was completely stunned. He had trusted Shen Lang and thought he'd get 3 or 4 questions right at best. But to his shock, he had gotten them all correct. This was an incredibly clever question. The most impressive was the last question. He had spent years studying it. Hu Wenqiu had completed 14 rows, and Shen Lang had completed 15. Though he had never shown it off, but he was still proud of himself. He never expected Shen Lang to complete 23 rows. This was too absurd. This was truly the work of a mathematical genius. The Count asked, "Mr. Lin, what do you think?" Mr. Lin bowed to the Count and said, "Congratulations, Master, for gaining the skills of a mathematical genius. I've never seen or heard anything like this." The Count said, "How many questions did he answer correctly?" Mr. Lin replied, "He answered them all correctly. What's more, Shen Lang's mathematical skills have far surpassed the limits of these 10 problems. I am deeply ashamed of my own abilities." The Count was immediately in disbelief, filled with unspoken joy. His son-in-law had already surprised him several times, especially with that unforgettable memory. But mathematics, wasn't that something that required a teacher's guidance? Was there really someone born with this talent? The Count said, "Langshi, how did you do it?" Shen Lang replied, "Father-in-law, I taught myself." The Count said, "But how did you reach this level without a teacher?" Shen Lang said, "Father-in-law, sometimes genius is just that excellent. It makes people feel hopeless. Mathematics relies 99% on talent and 1% on hard work." At this, even Kim Moku was too shocked to pay attention, and the Count didn't seem to care either. He just wanted to strike Shen Lang. "No wonder you, Shen Lang, don't have any friends." The Count was now going to question Hu Wenqiu directly as to why he tore Shen Lang's paper. But with so many students present, he didn't speak out. He couldn't face the humiliation of such an event in front of everyone. But Shen Lang loved this kind of confrontation. "Mr. Lin, why did you tear up my test paper earlier? Or did you want to destroy it without evidence?" Instantly, Hu Wenqiu's face turned pale, and his teeth began to clatter with anger. Shen Lang continued, "Mr. Hu, you said that if I answered 5 questions correctly, you would apologize. Now I've answered all 10. What should I do? Of course, as a teacher, if you apologize to me, I won't force you. After all, I am someone who respects my teachers. But since you, Mr. Hu, are a teacher, surely you'll make good on your word." When these words were spoken, all the students in the room were excited. It was rare to see this kind of spectacle. The cruel and arrogant Hu Wenqiu was about to get slapped in the face? The eyes of everyone turned to Hu Wenqiu. He felt hot all over. This was the most humiliating moment of his life. He wanted to disappear into the ground. Was he really going to apologize to this little brat Shen Lang, who still had the smell of milk on his breast? How could he save face? "You don't know anything, and you have no dignity," he said. Then Hu Wenqiu turned to leave. He wanted to leave in disgrace. He had already decided that, from now on, he would stop teaching and only manage the Count's affairs. He didn't need to deal with these students anymore. But just then, the Count spoke. "Mr. Hu, as a teacher, it's most important to be a model in both words and actions.
to set a good example. For the Count, these words carried a lot of weight. Hu Wenqiu was about to wave his hand and leave, but in the end he didn't dare. After all, the Count was his master. Then the Countess slowly walked over, her voice gentle but firm. If you've done something wrong, you must bear the consequences. When you say something, you must make good on it. The Countess, as a relative of Hu Wenqiu, was his support. With both masters speaking, Hu Wenqiu no longer dared to act recklessly. So, he gritted his teeth and walked over to Shen Lang. In front of everyone's gaze, every step felt as heavy as 1,000 pounds. He cupped his hands and bowed to Shen Lang and said, "I'm sorry, Shen Lang. I was too reckless earlier, and I wrongfully accused you." This was humiliation. Never before had he felt utterly shamed. "O great earth, open up a crack for me to crawl into."